Good evening, everybody. I gather there's something else going on at 6 o'clock, some other announcements, but I'm really, really pleased you've chosen to spend the time with us this evening. And welcome to this presentation and discussion of some new research about how young people consume news and what the mainstream media can do to attract their attention. So my name is Nick Newman from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University. For those of you who don't know us, we're an independent research institute. We also run a fellowship program, and we also do a range of leadership development courses. We commissioned this research this evening, but we're mainly going to hear tonight from the strategic consultancy Flamingo, who actually did the hard work, and also from a fantastic industry panel that I will properly introduce later on. Just a couple of other things from me before we start those. So this was commissioned as part of our wider digital news report efforts this year. So I'd like to thank all of the sponsors of that for helping make this possible, including Ofcom, the BBC and Google, who I think are all in the room today. I would also particularly like to thank News UK, publishers of the Sunday Times and the Times and the Sun, for their very kind hospitality this evening and this amazing and wonderful venue where you get to see the train sets underneath there. These amazing views. And as well as contributing to the panel, we have Nick Petrie here. We're also going to hear from some members of, they have a Gen Z board who helped sort of advise News UK on some of the issues we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm going to involve them as well. Finally, I would just point out before we start that this event is being filmed, so there will be a record of it later, but also if you are asking questions later, it will be helpful to use a microphone and to say where you're from as part of that. And in terms of the report itself, there are printed copies available here tonight, and also, if you prefer, PDFs from the Reuters Institute website. Now, the starting point for this particular research was this chart, which may be familiar to some of you from our Reuters Institute digital news report, where we ask about what people's preferred ways of accessing news are. So do you prefer television? Do you prefer print, social media, online news sites? What do you prefer? And this is UK data from 2019. And this chart really just shows this incredibly stark generational split in terms of preference. So on the left-hand side, you see under 35s voting essentially for digital and for social media. On the right-hand side, you see older groups, over 55s in particular, preferring still television and print. And in terms of social media, if you just look at the 18 to 24s, so-called Gen Z, 27% of 18 to 24s say that they get their main news now from social media, compared with 13% from TV. And this chimes, many of you will know, the recent Ofcom research that was much quoted. 18 to 24s, on average, watch just 2 minutes of television news a day, which means most of them watch none. And that compares with over 30 minutes for over 55. So this generational split. And it's not just about TV. We also know from our digital news report that online behavior is very different too. So under 35s are twice as likely to consume news via a smartphone. They're much more likely to use online video. They're twice as likely to use a news podcast, for example. They're less likely to trust the news, and they're less likely to be loyal to a particular news brand. So partly as a result of that, we know that most media companies are really struggling to attract those younger audiences and to retain them, not just for those traditional formats, so television and print, but for their online properties too. So the point of this research was really to understand why that's happening and what could be done about it. So we had really three core questions. So firstly, is it to do with the agenda? Is it to do with the tone of voice? Is it to do with the distribution, that the journalism is just not getting through to people on the right platforms? Secondly, there's a lot of talk about this. What are the differences between so-called Gen Z and young millennials? Are there significant differences in terms of their news consumption? To understand more about that. And then thirdly, what do we do about it? So what do media companies need to do differently? What different formats or approaches might resonate with these groups? And so that was the challenge we posed to Flamingo, the research agency. And the format tonight is we're going to hear first from Flamingo about the behaviors and the attitudes, and then we'll get some reactions from our panel to that. And then we'll have a second tranche of presentation where we'll hear about some potentially some solutions, precisely what media companies could do differently. And then we'll have more discussion here from you guys as well. So that's enough from me, plenty from me. Let's hand over to Flamingo, and I'm going to introduce first of all the team and Matthew Taylor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you everyone for coming, and of course thank you to News UK for hosting us. Right, how are young people consuming the news, and what on earth can traditional news brands do to better build relationships with them? Well, Lucas, the head of our applied data science team, and I are going to take you through our main findings exploring this challenge, and then Tim, after the panel, will take you through some of the implications for the industry. We were also joined by Jordan on the project, who ran the semiotics analysis, and he is in the audience today. There needed to be at least this number of us because of the diverse and mixed methodology that we applied to the problem that Nick came to us with. It wasn't the simplest of problems, and we were keen to do that fact justice without overcomplicating things either. We used 3 different angles for coming at people's behavior, starting with digital tracking, an innovative approach that enables us to track people's behavior on their mobile phones and then display that data on an intuitively visual and interactive platform, with their permission, of course. Here we could observe what really happens when news is consumed in its new competitive environment, alongside all the other sources of information and entertainment that we find online and on our phones. Toward the end of those 2 weeks, people also did a digital diary. They sent us screenshots, links, and images of all the news that they've been consuming over a few days, and then we processed that information and analyzed it. Similarly, they did a day when they were either deprived of their favorite news brand, or we forced them to use a particular brand only if that brand was of interest. Finally, we then met them in person, face-to-face, and spoke to them in interviews. And then half of these were then followed by some friends, and we ran these creative sessions where we actually explored more innovative formats of news that we'd picked out. We then used semiotics to analyze what was really going on from an executional point of view. We chose some of the content that we'd seen these people consuming, and we also chose content ourselves, which represented good or bad examples of the themes that had already started coming through. So in total, we tracked 20 phones, interviewed 16 people, and ran 8 friendship triads. Okay, maybe we did overcomplicate it a little bit, but it worked for us. So the role of news in young people's lives. In a time when the competition for attention online has merged with all these different types of media content into the same arena, it is super important to understand this, so that news brands can play to that role and decide how their individual brand fits into that space too. But first, we must remember that we are not talking about a single homogeneous group here. Even generational labels are mainly useful heuristics to generalize diversity. We shouldn't go around putting people into boxes. So here's a slide with generations in boxes, emphasizing useful heuristics. We also didn't go into this analysis totally blind either. Flamingo have actually done a few studies into the youth and media, including our own Gen Z Redefining Authority white paper. We did apply a particular news lens, though, as we sought to analyze the different goals, values, and ambitions of these generations that might dictate their news habits. It's unavoidable that Gen Z are the first true digital natives. Whereas most millennials can remember a world before the internet and email, let alone social media, they migrated to the digital online world, albeit more successfully than some. This leads us to some differences. Gen Z tend to have a higher expectations for a totally seamless and frictionless online experience. They are also more transactional as a generation, meaning they are more resourceful and pragmatic, visibly considering what they can get out of a given activity or relationship. The way I sometimes like to think about it is comparing two friends. There's always one friend who's like, oh yeah, man, it's the journey that matters, not the destination. And then there's the other friend who says, no, I want to get to my destination because that is where I'm going. And finally, where the experience-driven millennials value discovery and learning, we find that Gen Z value curation and control online, which fuels their creative expression. But still, even cutting across these differences, two big themes did emerge: progress and enjoyment. By progress, we mean a sense of I want to develop myself personally, I have goals that I want to reach in my personal life and my work life, and I want to escape the shackles of societal expectations or stereotypes. I also want to look after myself. And then there's enjoyment, which could just have easily been called fun. I want to enjoy my life, have fun experiences, be entertained. I want to do what I love. And then across these, we saw 6 core needs that young people have from the news. Some with more of an outward focus, and some with more of an inward focus. On the progress side, news can deliver status, it can contribute to our identity, and it can help us learn. On the enjoyment side, we find that news can build connections, entertain us, or provide a space for us to follow our passions. Now, if this looks like a lot of different things the news can do for this audience, that's because it is. And in fact, we feel that it is already doing much of this. Young people are, on the whole, engaged with what's going on in the world. Moreover, with the digital revolution, globalization, the explosion of grassroots media outlets, there's arguably more news, or at least more access to news, than ever before. The problem is that traditional news brands are no longer the only source of that information on what is going on today. Meaning these core needs do not necessarily translate into direct relationships between young people and traditional news brands. By and large, it feels like this is because there is a bit of a disconnect between how young people approach the news and how traditional news brands view it. In a slightly simplified way, for traditional news brands, the news remains about what you should know. And while this is still somewhat true for younger audiences, the news has merged with so much other different types of content online now that they also see it as something that should be personally useful, interesting, or fun. And while the industry is definitely moving in that direction, can it really be said to be thought of as fun? So our main takeout from all of this is that the role of news for young people appears to be primarily individualistic. It is about what it can do for them as individuals rather than for society as a whole. How can this help me progress? Am I going to enjoy this? Having established this overall attitude, it is now time to look into young people's news habits and behaviors, which my colleague Lucas will run you through.
Right. So, as part of this project, we observed a lot of digital behavior on people's phones. Basically, that involves tracking the apps that they're using, the behavior that they display online. And boy, these people use their phones a lot, as you could expect. Roughly around 440 minutes a day on average, which is not entirely time that they're looking at their phone. It's just moments where their phone is being actively used, listening to a podcast or music. The immediate thing that you'll find of interest is obviously there's a huge dominance from apps like Instagram and WhatsApp. But what's really interesting is that no news app really even breaks the top 25 among people's use in their phone. And the only one that could be categorized as breaking the top 25 is Reddit. And as we know, it kind of provides a mixed entertainment and news kind of platform. Or to take a look at this from a different perspective, we can see it from a proportional perspective. So to give you an example, phone, we usually have this rule of 3 or a rule of 2, depending on the person. But generally speaking, when we are doing kind of observations of cell phones, people have 2 to 3 dominant apps, and then what we call a long tail of apps that you use, like your chronometer or like Fitbit, which I have on my phone, but I never use. So for example, here's a standard phone. We've got Snapchat and Instagram. They roughly account for over 50% of the usage. We've got a ton of other apps, And then very, very low down, we've got the BBC News app. Or to give you a different example, again, YouTube, Safari, Netflix, JobSpotter, Deal or No Deal, and eventually the BBC News app. It's simply just not something that they use their phone as regularly for. Based on this research, all of the observations we made about people's digital behaviors, the face-to-face interviews, we identified kind of 4 moments for news. Some of them are pretty standard and others are kind of new, but we really have, 4 different ways in which people approach the news, and then 4 different real implications to what kind of news they want and what kind of content they want at that time. Starting with the dedicated moment, which is really, that idea of there's this fascinating story you've got to read, you've set time aside, really want to just consume the news much like you would consume a book. What's valued here in terms of content is the quality of it, that the writing particularly speaks to you, the supporting multimedia. Another quite obvious moment is the updated moment, which is, we probably all do it when we wake up in the morning or in the evening, is that desire to just get a quick understanding of what's been happening, right? Get me the news so that I can carry on with my day and have an understanding of what's been going on. There, obviously, our need and the particular use is speed and concentration of information. But we start getting into slightly weirder places with time filler. I mean, we all do it. Time filler is something that we wouldn't get to those 440 minutes if it wasn't for it. And that's that every 5 seconds, I'm tempted to it even on stage, is we look at our phones and check out what's been going on. That could be Instagram, that could be Reddit, that could be Twitter. Whatever it is, news has a role here. It's just that the competition is very strong. Obviously, it's competing with other things, trying to get attention and entertainment. And the final moment, which we thought was really worth highlighting, is the interceptive moment. This is the only non-active moment. This is a passive moment where someone in your group of friends or family sends you an article and says, hey, check this out. And that's actually worth noticing because that's the one vector through which we saw people adopting news outlets that they weren't expecting. So, from that perspective of the moments, we move on to trying to understand the key differences of news habits of our respondents. On the one hand, we divided them according to whether they use a lot of news or not so many. Obviously, through using their phones, we can see what kind of consumption they have, and we supplemented this with our face-to-face interviews. But the other axis that we analyzed is a little bit more interesting. We were concerned between a brand-led news environment, which is one where we go to the BBC, The Guardian, wherever, to get the news, and we count on that institution to supply a wide gamut of what's happening in the world right now. We want those places to curate our news experience. And the reverse, which is the self-led. Increasingly, as technology is making this available, we have people who love configuring their RSS feed. They love optimizing what information they're getting, and they're really leveraging that. So they are curating their own news experience. All of our respondents kind of fall somewhere in this matrix. Obviously, it's worth reflecting that this study is much more about surgical behavior understanding and not necessarily numerical understanding, but it does lead to 4 very neat different behaviors in terms of what these people are expecting from the news and what they want to get out of it. The first is the dedicated news devotee. I'm Spanish, so some of me saying this very, very quickly might not. Dedicated news devotee. Basically, these people are the news fanboys. They're really into the news. They have a very deep relationship with 1 or 2 outlets. They got the app. They buy the physical copy where possible. They're very interested in the news, and they're very traditional. Very interestingly, they have a kind of counterpart in terms of usage. We call these guys the heritage news consumer. What's interesting about them is that they see consuming the news as a key component in adulting, in what it means to be an adult, right? Like, they've observed their parents in this behavior, and often they take their news habits directly from their parents, and they know that it's a key component to be judged to be an adult, to know what's going on. They just don't really want to do it. They're a bit reluctant. It's a bit boring. For them, speed and consumption is what they're really looking for as quickly as possible. Then we've got the mirror to the dedicated news devotee in the proactive news lover. Now, this is a digital native, super savvy person that takes pride in still being really into the news, but configuring their news experience from their own curated RSS feed. These are the guys who get off on, following a story as it develops on Twitter, or really understanding the multiple viewpoints from reading multiple news sources. These things are kind of uniquely available thanks to technology. And finally, and least, I would say, the passive news absorber. These people just simply don't want to have a relationship with news brands. Now, it's very important to understand that we didn't come across anyone who just straight up said, I'm not interested in the news. It's just that they didn't want to have that one-to-one relationship with news brands. It felt like a lot of work. It felt like just something that they wanted to do quite quickly. And as a result, these 4 distinct types have unique opportunities for news brands. Starting with the heritage news consumer, this is the most straightforward kind of upgrade. If they get the information that they need in different formats that are appealing to their very busy lives, they're obviously going to establish a much deeper connection with news brands. So things like podcasts or summaries or ways in which they can get the news while still being time poor is very successful with them. The dedicated news devotee is already interested in the news. They already have a relationship with at least one news brand. What's perhaps interesting is that these are probably the people who are most likely to pay for a subscription, as inherently to them they see a value in having that one-to-one relationship. The proactive news lover, here's where we get into the interesting aspect of what can be done, but any way in which content can be made unique within the RSS feed, in which your own particular signature is in the content that you're bringing beyond the news, is what makes you stand up within that feed. And it creates a unique dependence for this person to at least want to get that viewpoint from time to time. And finally, the passive news absorber. Obviously, they're kind of reluctant to get involved, but again, anything that creates a very, very quick summary for them, a shortcut for them to get the information that they require to go on with their day without kind of having to engage that much, would be quite successful with them. And this is kind of what some of the patterns look like. I don't need to get too much into this, but every little pip there is engagement with the news app. On the left, we've got the Economist app, and on the right, we've got the Daily Mail app. And you can see it yourself, but we have kind of a clear pattern of using the Daily Mail app there in the morning, and that's great. But even in these dedicated news devotees, we can't forget that what they're mostly doing with their phones is really engaging with things like Instagram and Twitter. These are, again, 2 footprints from both dedicated news devotees. And we can see that on Instagram, they've got The Guardian, they've got Vice, and even, or other news sources. So although they have those dedicated moments, they also have a lot of that time filler relationship with news. So just to recap, 4 different moments in which people want to consume the news, 4 different kind of attitudes towards the news that we found in these young people. And in the final report, we get into it much more, but obviously the digital world really gives you a wide range of different tools and ways of engaging with people. So just some quick thoughts on that. Obviously, we found across the board less use of Facebook for news. Instagram cannot be overemphasized how important it is on these people's phones. It's literally off the charts often, in the sense that we have it in every phone that we tracked, and when we find it, we find huge usage of the app. Reddit and Twitter are becoming these incredible aggregation places because of the particular individualistic configurations that they allow. Reddit, from that sort of the front page of the internet attitude, configuring multiple viewpoints at the same time and giving the people who use it this feeling that they're getting multiple viewpoints. And Twitter, from this immediate access you have as things are unfolding. They're having a real resurgence. And finally, obviously, I don't need to say this, but podcasts are huge. They are a way in which we engage with information without having to use our eyes, and they feel easy and authentic to this audience. So just to recap, there's really no one-size-fits-all strategy for young people. There's not a silver bullet that if you just put like emojis, they're going to react. But things become clearer when you look at, rather than looking at them as a whole audience, as the different moment and person configurations. And this has a huge impact into what these audiences want from the news.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Lucas. Reuters. So we'll kind of come on to the specific recommendations in a minute, but we're going to have a bit of a pause and we'll come back to those. But I wanted to bring in, we've had a lot of old people talking about young people, so I thought it'd be useful to hear from some of the Gen Z. So can you put your hands up? Where are you? Oh, okay. Can I just ask, maybe Agna, if you, one of the Gen Z board members here at News UK who helps keep in touch, whether you can maybe just say a little bit via the microphone on, do you recognize yourself in this research? You know, you're like always on Instagram. Are you basically interested, you've got a very short attention span, you're only interested in entertainment? I mean, is this all true? Can't be, surely.
I mean, I always like find myself just scrolling, like opening my phone. Oh, on Instagram, I have to actually do my job. Yeah, I recognize quite a lot of myself and the stuff you said, especially like the stuff about TV. So I don't own a TV. I don't need a TV. I have a projector, which projects to the white wall, and I watch my Netflix and subscriptions, all I need.
I've heard about people like you who don't have TVs. Yeah.
I just don't find a need of it. I want to choose what I want to watch. And in regards to media consumption, all the apps, yeah, I prefer using Instagram and any other platform because I like to follow the brands I like. And also I like beautiful content. I like images. I like the stuff I can interact with, and I can message them, and they usually message me back.
And I mean, you saw there the sort of framework we were using for, you've got this sort of time filler moment, so when you've got a bit of time, you just 5 minutes on Instagram, presumably. But do you also have a dedicated moment for news?
Yeah, so usually I leave myself a Sunday morning to go through all the different medias I like to read, and also
You're not going to tell me you read a newspaper?
No. I like it online. I just like to scroll different news outlets. And then you said about reading different sides of the story. So because I'm EU, citizen, and I found myself reading a wee book which came, on a post about why Brexit is the best thing in the world, and I was just like reading it. Wow, I might be devoted, but that's okay. So it's just like different opinions and different ideas about the same story.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you. Round of applause. I think that's worth a round of applause. So let me now introduce our fantastic panel. So from left to right, we have Polly Curtis, who is editor and partner at Tortoise Media, also a visiting fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. But before that was editor of HuffPost UK, where you did a lot of work on young people and with some of the solution stuff we're going to talk about a little bit later. Natalie Malinorich is mobile and new formats editor of BBC News Online. She's led a whole range of initiatives in this area, including the BBC News app sort of video swiping stuff a few years ago. And Nick Petrie, deputy head of digital at the Times and Sunday Times, has also been overseeing a number of sort of the initiatives trying to attract and retain younger people. So maybe just first, just a few quick reactions from sort of your perspective on some of the things that you've heard so far and the things that have kind of stuck out from the research. Polly, maybe to kick off.
The research really resonates with my experience at HuffPost and Tortoise and The Guardian before that. I mean, it really puts the meat on the bone of what we understand about young audiences. And I think the main reflection is just how complicated it is going to be. You know, we used to publish a newspaper or publish stuff to a website and people would come and read it. Now we have to work so hard to reach people in lots of different ways, than ways where they're consuming this information. But there are also some things in there that I'm really excited about. I think we shouldn't underestimate this audience at all. There's the bit about younger audiences being really actually very interested in global issues is really, really exciting. And I don't think that's what the general impression is at the moment. So I think to have this kind of research to confront our expectations of younger audiences and challenge them is really important. Right,
and you were telling me earlier about a very specific example of that. I was also really struck by the global thing. Because one of the things that came out, we may be hearing in a minute, is the sort of nationalistic lens that traditional media tends to take, whereas younger people, because they grew up in university where they met lots of people or they travel more, have this real sort of global feel. And you were telling me about a sort of Tortoise case.
Yeah, so the Tortoise Model is based on something called a think-in, which is a meeting of people to talk about the news you're producing. And to make sure that we're having very diverse conversations, we're taking thinkings into lots of different contexts and different audiences to build a really diverse conversation. And we were doing a think-in with a group of 16, 17-year-olds who were applying to go to university as part of an access scheme. So they all came from really disadvantaged areas around the country, but were really, really ambitious. They wanted to go to university. And we asked them at the end of this think-in, what do you want us to report on? And one of them put their hands up and said, I want to understand the Sudan crisis. And then the whole room nodded and said, yes, that's what I want to read about. And it transpired that the week before there had been an Instagram meme around the Sudan crisis, which had compared Sudan with and how many people had died with what happened at Notre Dame, and really questioning the news values. And this had been everywhere once I looked at it. But no one was really addressing the meat of that story, that actually young people really wanted to know.
So that was the spark, but people wanted to know the sort of depth behind it,
what was behind this.
Yeah.
And I thought that's a really exciting thing that we can act on.
Great example. Natalie, what sort of thoughts did you have listening to that?
Yeah, so as with Polly, it resonated completely. I think one of the things that stood out for me is that slide where it says, news organisations think we want to give you what's important. Younger generations think we want what's important, but we also want things that are fun. And, we want things that are interesting. And they don't associate news organisations with that now.
And fun, yeah, and
entertaining. Fun. But I would argue that we do more of that. I mean, there's obviously room to do more, but we do more, and I'm sure loads of other news organisations do, but we're never associated with it. And it we were doing some prototype testing a few months ago, and we just put in some real content which we thought would appeal to young audiences, and they all love the content. They're like, but this is real content. Really? You do that? You do those kind of stories? And it just really surprised them. And I think that's a huge challenge when you think about, if you're already doing the content, like what more do you need to do to appeal to those audiences? And I think for me,
they don't expect it from you, is that?
They don't expect it, so they don't come looking for it. They will come for the big stories. And again, if you think Sudan Explainer, I mean, we've done more than one for sure. But still, they just don't see it there. They don't find it in the mass of everything else that is there. So it's that kind of, there's something else in the report which I'm pretty sure I'll address later, which is like making it easy to use. And I think that is a huge challenge.
Yeah, we'll come to some of the solutions later, or some of the things that media companies maybe need to think to do. Nick, what's your sort of sense of?
Again, I sort of found it very encouraging. It actually mirrors a lot of research that we've been doing ourselves sort of over the last 12 months, that our younger audiences want substance, they want depth, they want reporting that sort of really gets to the core of matters. It's helping them find it, and it's helping them understand that actually traditional news brands do cover the world in the way they want, just not necessarily with the same tone or things, and we're not very good at getting it to them.
Right, because the challenge is those charts which show where people are spending their time, and sort of less than 1% for the BBC News app, or assume the Times app will be the same. They're not going to come to you necessarily for that, but then your business model doesn't necessarily work in those distributed environments as well.
No, I mean, I think it is about how we put the great journalism we do in front of people in the right places, but also I think what you were getting at, Polly, which is when we used to just publish a newspaper, we had a readership and audience, and it did used to be a lot more homogenous than it is now. And it's already been very clear to us for a long time that our readership is obviously much more granular than one kind of Times or Sunday Times reader. And that just suggests that actually it goes many depths further than that, rather than young people. There's many layers within that, and that's the challenge for us, is how
So the complexity of how you tell your stories to different audiences in a way that resonates with them.
Without tripling the size of a newsroom.
I mean, to what extent is this a focus for your organisations? Maybe start with you, Natalie, in terms of the average age of the television viewer presumably is continuing to rise and is probably over 55, I don't know. The average rate...
It's not young, put it that way.
It's not young, but the average age of the website is also...
Is also not young, no.
Yeah. So are you focusing on this? Is this a problem that people are talking about in the BBC a lot?
And we've been talking about it for quite a few years now, and we do have different initiatives, both on the side of the newsroom, as in recruiting different people, making it more diverse, and making sure those people have a voice and have a say in the stories that we cover and how we cover them. But also there are initiatives that we have, things like In Plain Sight, which looks at doing different stories that aren't kind of in the media, kind of front of centre all the time. We have loads of things like that, but it's still, it is challenging. And again, you have, we had a few examples of personas there if you want, but there are lots more, right? You can divide it up till you get to pretty small groups, but there's still quite a lot of people, so
Yeah.
you can always do more.
And I mean, Nick, obviously we've heard about your initiative with the Gen Z board, trying to inform strategy here at News UK. What other things are you focusing on, and is it seen as a big problem, the next generation of readers?
Well, it's seen as a problem, but also as an opportunity.
Right.
Obviously, we're doing our best to grow the subscriber base as fast as we can, because it helps make us more sustainable, and younger people are a big part of that. We have a university pilot running.
But the average age of your subscriptions presumably is...
there's obviously digital subscription slightly younger than a print-only subscription. But yes.
Small comforts, yeah.
But yeah, no, obviously we do need to grow, because as any subscription-based business will need to is continue to bring in a new audience. So there's a university pilot that we've been working on, which is one way we've been looking at developing sort of relationships with new readers, with students over the lifetime of their degree. And we also use that as an opportunity to have them as a sounding board. So obviously we're doing increasing amounts of user testing as a rule across the way we develop the whole product, but there we've got a kind of ready-made group of people very willing to tell us what they think about their experience, and how we can make it better for them.
So getting closer to the audience, really understanding.
Yes.
Yeah. Polly, what sort of things are you doing at Tortoise now? With subscription business again?
We're not a subscription business.
Well,
we are a membership business, which is actually a really important distinction, because we're trying to do a very different kind of newsroom where the members actually fuel our journalism. So bringing members into our newsroom, going out to our members all over the country, sometimes in other countries, to discuss the journalism we're doing. If we have a membership that's very kind of one-dimensional, we're not going to get the full story. We're not going to get the challenge and the ideas that we need to do a different kind of journalism. And we were really pleasantly, frankly, surprised that when we launched, and in our first 6 months, 40% of our members are under 30, which is really fantastically
and they're
exciting.
Responding to that sort of wanting to be involved.
Yeah, so they're responding to being involved, having a stake in something, but also the idea that it's slow news that doesn't kind of compete with breaking news, which is really important and must always exist, but it's not what we're doing. They're responding to that idea. It gives us the challenge that we've got to make sure that we are producing journalism that's right for a big, broad audience. But the thing I wanted to say about that is that although we've got a very young audience, it's very professional and it's very London-based, and we're a membership organisation that charges between £50 and £250 a year. So that is a big blocker for diversifying your audience. So we're taking it to another level and working really, really hard to build a network of organisations that fill the demographic gaps we're missing. So building partnerships with organisations in the north of England, that represent disabled people, that work with older people, so that you really get a diverse kind of range of voices, and making that membership sponsored, paid for, so it doesn't become a blocker.
Great. We'll come back to the panel in a minute, but I just wanted to give Flamingo a chance to do the final bit, which is to talk about a little bit more about the attitudes that we found, which I think are really interesting, and then also potentially some things for media companies to think about, and then we'll come back to you for some thoughts. So I'm going to invite Tim Parker to do this final bit. Thank you very much. Tim.
So, let's get to the right slides. All right, so I'll talk you through a couple of thoughts around actually what all of this stuff potentially means and what we might think about doing around it. So a key thought really is that young audiences are less engaged with the news as delivered by traditional providers. And as part of this, we explored a number of different industry hypotheses around why this could be the case. So, is the news too negative, or are young people feeling overwhelmed just by the sheer amount of news that's out there? Or maybe actually fundamentally, is there some kind of crisis of trust in news providers? We also touched on areas of third-party spaces, relevance of tone, and I think there's a fascinating interplay between facts and opinions, and how actually you should kind of play that balance. But the first one I want to talk through is really looking at the relevance of the news agenda. So we found that the wider news agenda was broadly relevant, but what tended to dominate the headlines was felt to be too narrow and repetitive. So, this is kind of, it's possibly a bit of a sign of the times, but it's a sort of endless coverage of the same topics covered in the same kind of way. To the point that we mentioned previously, even a lot of the international news tended to be covered and reported back from a very kind of nationalist perspective, whereas people were quite interested in hearing actually, what's the take on the ground of people who actually, are living this particular news. And there was a feeling that a lot of this stuff actually came at the expense of one, variety, and secondly, human stories that are capable of inspiring young people's goals. The second hypothesis was around negativity in the news. So, yes, the news is seen as overly negative. Again, in some ways that is kind of, what defines the news, I suppose, in a lot of the times. But equally, there is a sense that actually news brands are overplaying the negative. But within this, there's a lot more than that going on. So it's all about, there's a perceived unfairness repeatedly targeting specific people, whether that be Trump or Corbyn. And also, there's a feeling amongst our young audience that too many extreme opinions are given equal hearing. The third point is kind of following on from this theme of the role of opinion. So young audiences, broadly, don't want to be told their point of view. They want help in developing their own point of view. And all too often, they feel that the news is either fact-focused and bland or is overly partisan, whereas what they want is to be exposed to a variety of genuine opinions, breaking away from what feels like a fairly stale and top-down left-right interpretations. Number 4 concerns the tone of the news. And what we found is that the tone of the news is not always relevant. There's a feeling that it can swing between two different extremes. On the one side, it can come across as quite dry and institutional, but equally on the other side, it can sometimes be quite strident and attention-grabbing, especially when you look at what happens online. Young people, again, in general, are drawn to a more human tone with definitely touches of informality and at certain times humour. The fifth is that news doesn't always feel in sync with the media environment in which it's in. And that's something that we found actually that chimes quite true, especially when it comes to social media. Content often fails to reflect the role of the platform and what that plays in people's lives. Equally, news brands can risk their credibility by trying a little bit too hard to fit in. So it's kind of like a little bit like the embarrassing dad that tries to be cool at a teenager's party. It just doesn't quite fit. The sixth point was around, a core hypothesis in all of this was around the issue of trust. Now, what we definitely didn't find was that there wasn't a crisis of trust in the media, but rather sort of an appreciation that everyone has got a slant, everyone's got a slight take on things. And interestingly, when it comes to things like fake news itself, it's just seen as more of a nuisance than a problem. Now, one result from that is that our audience are paying more attention to the source of news and potentially relying more on well-known traditional news brands to sort of help them navigate that kind of ambiguity that is present in the landscape at the moment. And I suppose the final and maybe one of the most critical points is that news can sometimes feel like a chore rather than something that you actively want to do. It requires effort to understand, it's less engaging than other content it competes with, and it can sometimes lack the seamlessness that young people have come to expect. So, I suppose a couple of thoughts, and I suppose, what can the industry do about the current state of affairs? And the word solutions kind of got thrown around a couple of times before. Definitely, we're not, I promise you, we're not going to present any solutions, but what we'd hopefully like to present are a couple of thought starters around things that you might think about. So, as Matt and Lucas has highlighted, our audience is really diverse and there's absolutely no silver bullet for news brands. But let's start with payment. Now, most young people that we spoke to claim that they're reluctant to pay for the news. And there's a whole host of interesting reasons that sit behind this. But one thought is that the current subscription model feels at odds with how they consume the news and are used to paying for content. So based on what we know about young people's attitudes and behaviours in this space, we'd like to suggest a few provocations for thought starters. The first one is around friction. So suddenly being unable to access an article can be something that's quite frustrating and really kind of break the flow of that online experience where people are looking for sort of seamlessness. So is there a way to seamlessly pay for an article that will allow you to access what you wanted to access in the first place? Secondly, our audience value freedom and variety, so they don't necessarily want to be locked in, and also, right now money's tight. So how could payment methods be closer to how people maybe used to pay for print? So, a little bit every day that made that quite accessible. Third is around the issue of control. So young people are used to curating their online world. So, how would that translate into subscription? So what if you could pay for single sections like sport, if that's the only thing that you're interested in, or maybe full access at certain key times, like at the weekend, when you're more likely to engage with this type of content. Number 4 is really learning from the likes of Netflix and Amazon. So, where people are used to shared access. So, what is the role of shared accounts in the context of news? And the 5th one is, Matt sort of talked us through that actually accessing multiple sources feels to be an absolute must. But current subscriptions tend to lock you into one. So actually, what could brand bundles look like? Or what could kind of paid aggregators across partner brands? So kind of sort of panning out and taking a step back from that, really, thinking more broadly about how news brands can drive engagement with younger audiences, we'd like to suggest 5 summary challenges and thoughts to be thinking about. The first one is that news can be complex, it can require effort and knowledge to engage with. So really, how can news be easier to access and consume? And what can you do without risking dumbing down and devaluing your brand? Secondly, is news content can feel, as you spoke about, slightly out of sync with the spaces that it occupies, especially when you think about social media. So how do you navigate telling your own stories in somebody else's space? How do you kind of do that balance of fitting in whilst remaining authentic to who you are as a brand, but equally who you are as a news provider compared to the other people that populate that space? Third, amongst our young audience, traditional news consumption habits are they're declining. So how do you attempt to restore those traditional habits in this changed world that Lucas and Matt have spoken us through? And how do you create potentially new forms of habit anchored in the kind of the daily ebbs and flows of contemporary life? A fourth point is that this is something that the people we spoke to have consistently told us about, is that they struggle to engage with the news that feels distant and unrelated to their lives. And again, a lot of that may be a question of perception, but that's certainly a kind of a narrative that we heard time and time again. So how do you make your agenda and approach more relevant? And the fifth one, it often feels that news brands are force their own ideology onto situations at the expense of a more of a considered point of view. So how do you ensure that you have a point of view that feels genuine and bottom-up as opposed to something that's kind of top-down and editorially driven? How do you help, most importantly, young audiences develop their own point of view? So I suppose to wrap up, one thing that we keep coming time and time again back to is that we mustn't forget that all of this stuff is happening within a backdrop of intense competition for share of attention. Entertainment, social media, and of course news all compete openly with each other. And when it comes to screen time, there's a prevailing narrative that actually that might soon be in decline. So to be successful, news brands need to capture a more significant share of this by building more direct engagement with their content. Additionally, we think the news brands need to think about the value that they deliver within this broader context of all the other stuff that people are doing and people are consuming, and sometimes at the same time. So as Matt showed us, a kind of consequence of this sort of open competitive landscape has been to change young people's expectations of the news. Now, the news needs to deliver value to them as individuals. It needs to support their desire to progress in life, as well as entertain and engage. So, That means, we think, learning lessons from the like of Facebook and Netflix around what they do around ease and accessibility of the experience, and thinking about the way that your content is written and presented, as well as how relevant and interesting content is surfaced and delivered. Because it sounds like from hearing that actually there's a lot of the stuff that is potentially there, but for some reason it's actually not reaching people, or young people are not aware of that. Secondly, is that news brands need to tell stories that are aligned with the expectations of young people and the moments in which they are open to consuming the news. So it means creating more formats that are native to mobile and social, and potentially also thinking about incorporating some of these ideas back into brands' own apps and websites. And lastly, the third one is, and this is a pure provocation, but the way that news media cover stories may need to change. So young people definitely don't want news brands to shy away from the serious and the difficult issues. But as part of that mix, they're looking for stories that can inspire them about the possibility of change. And whilst they do say that they're tired of media agendas and stereotypes, what they're not looking for is for blandness for balance's sake. So they respond to stories with a point of view, absolutely, as well as human tales that are told with authenticity and that feel very much from a ground-up perspective. So that's why things like Twitter and Reddit that are very much grassroots-driven and ground-up, this is why those sorts of sources are super important when it comes to the news. So the really final thought from all of this is that obviously what's kind of become apparent, which you guys will know far better than we do, is that, it's a super challenging time, but equally it really feels one of change and one of opportunity for news brands. So thank you for listening, and I'd like to hand you back to Nick.
Thanks very much, Tim. So I think maybe, I don't know if Hannah, maybe we could just have a quick response. Again, so there's lots and lots of different stuff in there about the problems of the media, too negative, needs to be more accessible, needs to build the trust again. Maybe you should just ask a little bit about how you feel about that. What do these kinds of solutions that we've been talking about help? Where do you think the problem is? Do you think young people will be prepared, like yourself, would be prepared to pay for brands?
Yeah, so I actually think it's like personalization, but also recommendations. So we very much if my friend says to me, Han, go watch this film, or Han, go read this article, I'll go and do it. But on a larger scale, I think there's a lot of influencers that we don't currently utilize, and they're seen as quite tacky, and they've built their reputation just from being on Instagram or whatever. But actually, as you've previously mentioned, everybody is on Instagram, so why don't you use it? You've got people like Dolly Alderton, who writes for the Times, who has a massive podcast. People follow her. They follow her brand. So we need more people like that writing in a position that is not from a more senior view. A lot of journalists have been in the career for a very long time, and we actually need people that are our age, writing to us, talking to us about problems that we deem important, but it's not in a patronizing view. And if we're then recommended by these influencers, I hate the word influencer because it's quite tacky, but people of following that would talk about sustainability, that will talk about the Amazon rainforest fires, that all came through Instagram. That's how I found out about it, because people were sharing it, and it means a lot to us. But also personalization. So there's a lot of rubbish that you have to filter through, even if you're on an app, say the Times, for example. I work in marketing for the Times, and I know that there's so much information that is incredibly useful.
Okay, so you're filtering through the rubbish on the Times, not on Instagram.
No.
Everything on Instagram is, this is a key point, right? Everything on Instagram is absolutely relevant to you, but things in traditional media has a lot of stuff you've got to wade through to get to the stuff that you're interested in.
Even one brand, so everything that the Times writes is not going to be for me.
Yeah.
But there's no ability to really search these apps or go on the websites and really dig into what you want to read.
Great.
So
thank you very much, Hannah. So that's really kind of interesting, because it is part of one of the sort of key recommendations that we heard, Nick, which is about making this stuff more personal, making our own properties easier to find, as well as trying to make it accessible in third-party networks. And you're thinking a lot about these kind of issues, right?
Yeah, actually, I think it's a really interesting one, because one of the really core things we get back from lots of our existing subscribers of all ages is how much they value the curation and the editorial judgment role that we're playing. And personalization obviously gets really dangerous as to, sort of, and we also know the damage that personalization has done on Facebook and in other networks in terms of drawing people deeper and deeper into certain rabbit holes.
But you just heard the difficulties of finding the things that they want, right?
And so somehow we have to find a way to strike that perfect balance between sort of you not feeling like you're being pulled down certain rabbit holes and missing out on wider points of view, whilst also finding it much easier to find the things that interest you. I think it's really, really hard. I also think it's really hard when you're then talking about audiences of hundreds of thousands of people and how you do that for each one of those people.
I mean, the other thing I thought was interesting about that was the fact that the hook is quite often in social media. So we heard the Sudan example, we heard the Amazon example there. But then how do you connect it to a brand like the BBC, for example?
Yeah, and I think there's a timeliness issue, so we probably will need to be better at working out what's going on Instagram and other platforms now, not kind of a week later. But it is very hard to associate that. And I think, we are on Instagram, we're big on Instagram, but
you're a formal big brand, right?
We're a formal big brand, but I think at the same time, if you went on Twitter the week of the Amazon fires, how many people say no big news brand is covering the Amazon fires? And I'm pretty sure we all were. Right? So again, that's not just personalization as well. I mean, I think, personalization can play a really important role, but as Nick says, there is still value in curation. I think people appreciate it. That's what editors are paid for, essentially. So how do you combine that, and how do you get people, how do you even, beyond notifications, how do you alert people to the fact that you are doing the story that they're really interested in? So if they don't happen to bump into it because the Facebook algorithm or some other algorithm favoured your content over someone else's, it's really difficult. I mean, and I'm not pessimistic, I'm actually quite optimistic about it, because I think just the fact that people are into it and really interested in news and different content is great, but I think it is very challenging.
I suppose, the challenging thing which we've talked about before is how do you embrace these new platforms at the same time as not dumbing down and sort of keeping your core brand identity?
Well, I think some of that dumbing down is going to be welcomed by dumbing down. It's going to be welcomed by older audiences as well. A lot of news has been written too complicated.
But you're not talking about dumbing. You're talking about explaining things better.
Explaining things better,
right.
Yeah, not dumbing down. Explaining things better is something that we can all do, and that all audiences, I think, would really welcome. I mean, watching that, what was really striking me, that links to your point, is that at HuffPost, being a digital-born brand, me and my predecessors had identified so many of those issues. Solutions journalism is what HuffPost was built on, and it was built on that because the audience was asking for that and responding really well to that. We worked really hard to make our journalism as accessible as possible, so that we weren't dumbing down, but we were just explaining it like you'd explain it to your friends more. And we tried to kind of get out of the media bubble and get into the country more and away from the kind of bubbly idea of what news is. And then also do a lot of lifestyle content that was really, truly about what people's lives were about. And, I think HuffPost does some fantastic things, and a lot of the things you're suggesting, and it still struggles to find enough audience to sustain a business model. It just does. It's in a good position now, but it's difficult.
Yeah,
it's
and that
really,
of course
really
is one of the core problems about engaging more with third-party platforms, is the business models and the terms of trade with the platforms aren't necessarily there yet. I'm going to ask, just open this up to the audience in a minute, so if you want to start thinking about any questions. We've got about 10 minutes and then we'll get to drinks. But I just wanted to raise one other issue, maybe with Matt, which always slightly confuses me, which is about this issue of point of view and opinion. So on the one hand, people say that they don't like all this sort of talk about politics and everyone expressing their opinion within social media. On the other hand, they say they want a point of view. Can you just sort of explain what exactly is wanted?
Yeah.
And then we'll get some reactions from the audience.
Absolutely, I can. I think what a large part of what we were finding was that repetitive feed of the same kind of story that was getting through to the headlines and was occupying the main page, the landing experience when you go to that brand. And not only was it often a similar topic, but it was also a very predictable take on that topic. And I think it was that repetition that was very predictable, especially when you think about a lot of these younger audiences. They create a lot of media themselves. They're very active now because our mobile phones can essentially create very perfect quality stuff that you can throw on YouTube and feel like you do have access to this perception of being a media maker. And with that, there's that awareness that there's a lot of different angles that can come with this. They kind of gave this theory of, kind of the idea that impartial news isn't very possible, really. So whilst opinions are quite guaranteed, I think they know that this repetitive same angle on a story is
so they don't want this
deliberate.
False balance of
Exactly.
this view and that view for the false balance, but they also don't like the sort of the very traditional opinion from one side and the opinion from the other side, which you just hear again and again. But they want point of view, right? To help.
But they want a point of view, and I think the other traditional approach, apart from opinion versus opinion, might be to try and be totally objective. But they're not necessarily convinced that that is a possibility due to their experiences and their awareness of subjectivity. So that's why I think it is that real, we've considered this story and the facts, and here's our point of view on it, trying to help you then be able to collate a few points of view and formulate your own.
Right.
I was really thinking about the 18-year-olds in the study and their news experience, because they've had the longest, slowest, most boring, most important story dominating their entire teenage years. You know, it's nearly 4
It's gone on
years
for
of
a long
Brexit.
time, yeah.
That's going to affect how you feel about the news. I'm sick of Brexit. Like, we're all sick of Brexit, and we all, and yet gripped by it.
It was quite funny in some of the, particularly in the friends groups, you'd have people kind of, one would be like, no, I actually don't actually follow the news anymore because of that. And then the other one could be like, you're not following the news? And then these kind of, these guilty admissions would come out. But yeah, it has had a big impact.
I mean, you must have a lot of talks about this in the BBC in terms of the whole impartiality question. And I mean, I've noticed you are sort of commissioning more opinion and points of view, right? Is that a response to these kind of trends?
I think we've been doing it for years, actually. We probably started in the US, where I think this probably started slightly earlier than here. We're just really careful labelling them. And again, we do the kind of, here's one and here's another. We rarely do one opinion on its own. You know, I mean, it's over time, but still, it is, and it's challenging. It is, again, challenging.
Particularly challenging for a public service broadcast.
Particularly for us, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess point of view is something you've always really focused on at the time.
I mean, it's something we pride ourselves on, obviously, in having sort of relatively diverse traditional voices. The way, because we've heard a similar thing as well in the kind of research we were doing earlier in the year, and what we were hearing is it was more the people giving the opinions that was the problem, is they don't reflect the audience. So the overall selection of opinions is
So it's diversity, it's really an issue of diversity.
Absolutely. And so it's more a case of, it's not that too many of them are too, sort of like we go one way or the other, but it's just that we don't either talk about the issues that younger people want to sort of have that kind of opinionated sort of comment piece on, or when it does, it's always from an older, at least, point of view, which obviously just doesn't resonate.
And it is often the same people doing the rounds, right? So if you just watch TV, listen to the radio, read papers, it is basically the same people whose opinions are being published.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what they're
part of
reacting at. Okay, let's take some questions. So just pop up your hands and we'll take as many as possible. So the back, maybe. Yeah, younger people, definitely. Feels appropriate.
Are they not supposed to be giving us the answers?
Hi, so I'm project lead of education at the Financial Times, but perhaps more interestingly, I'm 19, so Gen Z, you've all been talking about me.
Yes.
But my question is less about capturing my peer group, but more about how do you retain younger readers or younger consumers of news in a world where there's far less brand loyalty? How do you build that habit?
How do you build that habit and trust? Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's how do you be genuinely useful or genuinely valuable in somebody's life? And the reason people stick with Netflix is because they continue to produce brilliant TV that draws you back in, and that has a utility for people. And you have to understand the role you play in people's lives and make sure you continue to evolve with them so that you are valuable, because it's about everything. Every product you buy in the world is a value exchange. That's worth that money for me, either because you fundamentally need it, food, or because you fundamentally like it. And we need to either be something you fundamentally need or something you fundamentally like.
I think we also need to make the case for news overall. We need to make the, we're all brands fighting for audiences, but actually where people are accessing so many different types of information on these platforms, we need to make a case that we are different and important.
Yeah. Some other questions, just pick anybody. Not anybody, but the best people.
Good choice. Hi, I'm Caitlin. I work at Harkin. And I had a question for you going back to one of the earlier slides, which was around that this generation, younger generation, thinks that larger news organizations only report on what they should know. And it's really, that comes from a little bit, potentially a bit of a patronizing tone. But what are some of the things that you do internally at your news organizations to fight that?
Well, I mean, Tortoise is just about listening to what our members and audience want, and that really drives the news we do. So I hope that addresses it that way.
We've been using Harkin. I hope that makes sense. But we've also done, audience takeovers or, pop-up operations in cities, both in the UK and in the US and other countries. We've done loads of initiatives. Again, like we have to keep doing them and finding more and new ways to do it. But it is important, definitely.
Yep. Let's take a couple more. Yep. Man at the back.
John Crowley from First Draft. I just wanted to ask Matt a question actually about one slide that I saw earlier, which you said the role of news for young people appears primarily individualistic, what it can do for them as individuals rather than for society as a whole. It sounds kind of rather nihilistic and makes young people sound rather selfish. Could you just go into that a little bit more, because it doesn't quite tally, at least with me, in terms of what young people are doing, in terms of climate change, in terms of global world affairs, what Polly was talking about on stage. So I'd appreciate just a little bit more insight into that one, please.
Yeah, so this point about the that this younger generation doesn't necessarily think about the news's role in society as much. It's more about the sort of utility side of things, I think was the point, right?
Absolutely. So thank you for that question. It's one of my favourite charts. I don't want to at any point say that these kind of younger generations aren't even proactively involved, let alone thoroughly engaged with everything that's going on in the world. That's kind of one of the big things, is that we really do think they're accessing way more news than we thought they were before going into this. But in terms of thinking about the way that they've perhaps started to have a bit of an individualistic approach to this, if we think about the fact that news content is now always appearing alongside, especially in this time filler moment, which even for the dedicated news devotee is the majority of the news that they're consuming, the news is now alongside so much entertainment and stuff which isn't necessarily important, it's just great fun, or it's someone I'm really passionate about, whether it's an influencer or whatever it is. And so those dynamics have come into play for consuming news content in those moments, and you need to be able to provide some of those as well. It wouldn't necessarily say that they're less aware of the impact that news can have. It's just when they are consuming news in that moment, it's going to be important for them to have those other things too.
I don't know if anybody from the News UK youth group wants to respond to that. You're very individualistic, apparently you don't have this point. No? How do you feel about it? Do you think this is realistic or less so?
I mean, I suppose we brought up the point about personalisation straight away, and that sort of individual thing, and also being so much all on our phones and things like that. We are, a discussion does come out a lot that we're nowhere near as social and like community as much as a generation.
So you talk about that with your friends?
Yeah, we do tend to say that
you
we're
recognise
very much
okay.
on our phone. We're not looking up and discussing things anywhere near as much as we go around because of our phones and that sense of like personalisation. We want everything to be tailored to us a little bit more.
Great. Interesting. Okay, we'll just take two more. So I think there's one down here and one over there. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
Hello, Rasmus Nelson from the Reuters Institute. I feel the conversation tonight has been very sort of careful and deliberate and very thoughtful and interesting, but I also can't help but feel that if I was sitting in your shoes as a publisher, I would be completely and utterly freaked out. And I just don't get that sense from you. I mean, the basic findings here is that the contact that young people have with news is something like 1% of the time they spend with media. And it seems to me that's an existential threat to journalism in terms of the political role that it plays, the social significance that it has, and the funding that it's based on, whether that funding is based on advertising sales or the selling of subscriptions or membership schemes or the legitimacy of public service media. So I just wonder whether I'm the one who is just sort of a panic-stricken old man who doesn't feel the world makes sense, or whether there might be a slight sense that we aren't actually fully confronting just the scale of the challenge ahead.
I'm freaked out by the challenge to the industry. I feel like at Tortoise we're actually trying to address exactly these issues. So I feel like a personal agency in trying to do something about it. But yeah, we should be really freaked out. But some of young audiences will grow up and consume news just like their parents did, and some of them will. But I do think something fundamental has also shifted, where the model is broken. The distribution model of audience and publisher is broken, and we're going to have to find new ways to get around that because of the business threat, but also because of the democratic threat. And those people who aren't going to grow up to consume news, that's where I would really kind of look to the BBC to lead the way. Don't just be kind of obsessed with youth because of the threat from Netflix. Think about, the people who are really excluded from news. I know you do this, but really excluded from the news conversation where there is no financial incentive, and that is exactly what a public service broadcaster is for.
Natalie, is the BBC freaked out by this? It is, isn't it? I mean, because your license fee depends ultimately on that next generation using the services.
No one is denying there's a huge challenge there. I still think, there's lots of things going on. There's lots of thinking and lots of, testing of new things. And again, personally, I'm quite optimistic about it, and I'm not freaking out yet. Maybe that's foolish. I actually don't think people will grow up and use the news in the way we do. No. I think they'll still use news, and we've seen they're interested in news, but I think it will be completely different. So I think if we don't do anything...
So we need new formats.
Yeah, if we don't do anything, we're kind of screwed, really. But I think we are, hopefully, doing things. And I do think there's something about... So you kind of have to think, like, if it's much easier for me to use Snapchat, however, how can anyone find it easier to use? But if you think Snapchat is easier to use, or Instagram, then what is it we can do that's different if we're not going to do it on those platforms? And I think there's something about, what's the promise we can offer that we can then meet? And, I think I use Instagram way too much, not for news though. And it's because I love the beautiful pictures and I like the dogs and things like that. So, kind of what is the news equivalent of that promise that Instagram always gives me something I like? And I don't know what the answer is, but I think that's kind of what we need to think. And I think it's not just, I think it's industry-wide, but I think I agree the BBC has a special role to play in that.
And Nick, are you worried enough? I mean, are people really, really worrying about this issue? It is a fundamental change, isn't it?
It is, although I suppose I'm just not freaked out because it's like the last 7 years have been hard, and the next 7 years are going to be equally as hard. I think the thing that encouraged me is the fundamentally in the research, they value what news is at some level, different tones, different presentations, but it's not the product that's the problem, it's the delivery and the consumption of it and the way in which they find it. And all of that kind of amazing attention about how to build great things for users has gone on stuff like Instagram and Facebook, and actually I think just fundamentally we have an execution problem. I think these are solvable problems. I think if news organizations were as good at some startups at actually identifying how to solve that problem and then doing it at speed, I think we'd actually solve a lot of these things a little bit faster. So it is something to be concerned about, but I also think it's solvable.
I think we're going to finish now. I know there's lots of other questions, but we will be around to sort of mingle. There's wine and nibbles waiting for us all there. So I think now's a good time to finish. I would just like to thank the panel very much, so to Polly, Natalie and Nick, and also the members of the Gen Z board at News UK, to Flamingo for a fantastic piece of work which is available in PDF and print form. Do take a copy. And if you want to know more about Flamingo or the Reuters Institute, please come and talk to us afterwards. Thank you very much indeed for coming.